Om Stapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. We bow down with humility and reverence to Sri Ramakrishna, the establisher of righteousness, the essence of all religions, and the greatest of divine incarnations. Good morning, everyone, on this beautiful Sunday. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Some of you may have seen the bulletin for this month and saw same goal, different paths and thought, oh my God, another lecture on the harmony of religions. I've heard this a million times. He's going to be preaching to the choir. In fact, this morning, a few days ago, when I was preparing for the lecture, I realized that there's a slight mistake in the title. It should not be same goal, different paths. It should be same goal, different paths, question mark. And that question mark makes all the difference. So online this morning on YouTube, I changed it to Same Goal, Different Paths question mark. So today I want to focus on the question mark. And I'm assuming that most of you, if not all of you, are already on board with the harmony of religions. Yes, we believe that different religions are different paths to the same goal. But this doctrine raises some very difficult questions. How deeply have you really thought about this doctrine of the harmony of religions? Let's try to get into the philosophical weeds of this doctrine and not just remain at a kind of superficial level. That's what I'm suggesting today. So I hope you do find some new questions, if not new insights, from this talk today about the harmony of religions. So this talk will have 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to raise 5, what I consider to be 5 very challenging questions about Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions, which I want each of you to consider for yourselves. Ask yourself how you might answer these questions. Don't all shout at once. Otherwise it'll become chaos. But think mentally about how you might answer these questions. So that's part 1. I'll be discussing these 5 questions raised by the doctrine of the harmony of religions. In the second part, I'm going to explain in some detail what I take to be the doctrine, Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions, and what's distinctive about it. And on that basis, in part 3, I'm going to suggest answers to these 5 difficult questions. And I don't expect all of you to agree with my answers, but the main purpose of this talk is to encourage you to think about these questions, which are very deep and not very easy to answer, and come up with your own answers. So, what are these 5 difficult questions? First difficult question. If we study the world's religious scriptures, we're going to find that the different religions teach different goals. Or at least it seems like that. The Bible talks about the Christian heaven. The Quran talks about a Muslim heaven, which is not the same as a Christian heaven. They call it Jannah. Different Hindu bhakti traditions accept many different kinds of eternal heavens, different lokas, different transcendental realms, Vishnu loka, Goloka. There's so many. We have our Ramakrishna loka, and they keep multiplying within Hinduism. The Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism, they say, oh, this is all nonsense. There's no coming and going in the final state of liberation. There's only resting in your true swarupa, your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Yet another goal, which seems to be completely different from all the others. What about the Buddhist goal of nirvana? Also seems to be different. Some of you might have heard of Frank Morales, M-O-R-A-L-E-S, an American who I think has become a Hindu priest. He wrote a pamphlet in 2008 called Radical Universalism. Does Hinduism teach that all religions are the same? And it's a kind of polemic against Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. Let me read you from it. This is his main objection. He says, there are several radically distinct and wholly irreconcilable religiously inspired ideas about what constitutes the absolute. Consequently, rather than attempting to artificially claim that there is only one mountaintop toward which all religions aspire, it would be more truthful and more in keeping with what the various religious traditions themselves actually say to state that there are several different mountains, each representing a radically different idea of what is the absolute. There is a Nirvana mountain, a Brahman mountain, an Allah mountain, a Jaina mountain. Some mountains are monotheistic, some are polytheistic, henotheistic, pantheistic, or panentheistic. Moreover, it is incumbent upon us all individually to choose for ourselves which of these many possibly correct absolute mountains we wish to scale. Only one of these mutually exclusive philosophical mountains, however, can be the correct one. So this is a very interesting criticism of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. How would you respond to Morales? This is the first question, the first challenging question. He's asking, it's one thing to just declare that all the different religions lead to the same goal, but it's patently false. If you study the world's religion, you're going to find they don't teach the same goal. They teach different goals. All right, how would you answer the question? Second big question, difficult question. What would Sri Ramakrishna say about religiously inspired terrorist organizations. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Aum Shinrikyo is another one, which is slightly more obscure, but it was a religious terrorist organization in Japan that involved a lot of violence. You can think of your own example. They explicitly say we're grounded in some kind of religion, and yet they commit violence, they commit killing. And Sri Ramakrishna says that all religions are paths to the same goal. Isn't he becoming too inclusive? Don't we want to exclude religiously inspired terrorist organizations? Second big question. How would you respond to that question? Third difficult question. This is a hoary problem in philosophy of religion and theology. Any philosopher who wants to defend the harmony of religions has to respond to this problem. It's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. There's so many religions in the world, and the person who believes in the harmony of religions maintains that all of these different religions are different paths to the same goal. They're equally valid in leading to the same goal. The problem is that different religions make different claims, which often conflict with each other. What are some examples? Did Christ die on the cross? What does Christianity say? Yes. What does Islam say? No. Is rebirth true? Is the doctrine of karma true? Orthodox Abrahamic religions say no. Hinduism and Buddhism say yes. So how can all these different religions with conflicting doctrines be equally valid paths to the same goal? If some religions are right about some things and other religions are wrong? This is another question. Fourth difficult question. You'll find when you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that when Sri Ramakrishna teaches the harmony of religions, that he mentions a number of different religions. He says Hinduism and different traditions within Hinduism, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, and so on, Advaita Vedanta. He mentions Idaning Brahmogani, the contemporary followers of the Brahmo Samaj. He mentions Christianity. He mentions Islam. But there's one that he doesn't mention in these contexts usually. Buddhism. Buddhism often comes off as the odd man out, or the odd person out in religions, because it's difficult to explain. On the one hand, Buddhism doesn't seem to be theistic. On the other hand, it's not easy to assimilate all of Buddhism to Advaita Vedanta. So how would Sri Ramakrishna accommodate Buddhism? Does his doctrine of the harmony of religions accommodate Buddhism? If so, how? This is another very difficult question. Fifth question. It's one thing, it's nice to believe that all religions are different paths leading to the same goal. But why should we believe it? In high school, I grew up in Boston, so in high school, one of our texts was Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. Either that was high school or undergrad, I don't remember. In any case, the very end of The Sun Also Rises, the last sentence, isn't it pretty to think so? It's a devastating way to end a book. Isn't it pretty to think so? Maybe skeptics of Sri Ramakrishna will say, oh yeah, that's great, but isn't it pretty to think so? That all religions, let's all be happy and hold hands, and Islam and Christianity and Buddhism, oh yes, everybody's going to the same goal. Prove it. What evidence do we have that it's true? This is another big question. How do you justify that position against many other competing positions on religious diversity? So, those are the 5 big questions. I hope the brains are already churning. How would you answer these 5 questions? And as I said, now I want to move to part 2, which is my understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. And then I will, on that basis, give my own answers to these 5 questions. And then I want you to think for yourselves about how you would answer these questions. So, part 2. What is Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions? Let's try to bring in a little bit more philosophical rigor to this discussion than is customary, let's say. I think it helps to bring in a very, very influential threefold typology introduced by the American Christian theologian Alan Race in 1983. He said that there are 3 basic paradigms for thinking about the relationship among the different world religions. First, exclusivism. Second, inclusivism. Third, pluralism. So what are these three paradigms? They've been defined in subtly different ways by different scholars. I'm giving you a kind of simple definitions for the purpose of this talk. Exclusivism is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, or if you want to call it liberation, call it liberation. No other religion leads to salvation. Tough luck. Inclusivism. Only one religion leads directly to salvation or leads to the highest salvation. Other religions are not hopeless, but they lead either to lesser salvations or they lead indirectly to salvation. They're indirect paths, but not direct paths, like my religion. That's inclusivism. So you see how in inclusivism there's always this kind of talk of higher and lower. Other religions aren't wrong, but they're lower than mine. We're gonna, I'll just give you an example on both sides. In Christianity, there's a Catholic theologian named Karl Rahner, a German theologian, R-A-H-N-E-R. And he has this wonderfully condescending idea of anonymous Christians. And he says that all non-Christians are actually Christians without knowing it. And so this is inclusivistic in nature. Christianity is the highest. Other people are unwittingly practicing Christianity, and Christ is gracious enough to admit them, non-Christians, into his fold. But you can see there's a hierarchy there, right? And on the Indian side, the Indian spiritual side, classical Advaita Vedanta is a good example of an inclusivist harmonizing of the world religions. Because we'll get to this later. I'll explain why. Let me stay tuned for why I think that classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara and his followers, will also, and if you try to explain the harmony of religions from the classical Advaitic standpoint, you end up with inclusivism, higher and lower. You can't get beyond that. But what we want is the third paradigm, religious pluralism. This is the view that multiple religions are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of salvation or liberation or whatever you want to call it. There's no higher and lower here. Now, I want to make the case that Sri Ramakrishna was a religious pluralist, not an exclusivist, obviously, but also not an inclusivist. And this is sort of already controversial, because there are other monks in our order who have written scholarly articles defending a classical Advaitic interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's views on the harmony of religions. Dideshananda, Omkarananda are examples. Dideshananda, mainly. So I'm arguing against that position, and I want to claim that he was a full-blown religious pluralist. He didn't talk in terms of higher and lower. He gave equal validity and efficacy to the different world religions. On my understanding, his doctrine of the harmony of religions is based on a very unique and expansive spiritual experience, which he called vijnana. So let me read to you his teachings on these two spiritual states, which he calls jnana and vijnana. He says, the jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman, meaning the impersonal, attributeless Brahman, through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The vijnani sees that the reality, the divine reality, which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as vijnana. So he's contrasting two different spiritual outlooks based on two different spiritual experiences. First is jnana. This is the paradigm of classical Advaita Vedanta. You realize your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, and you do it through one special spiritual yoga called Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, and you look upon this world as a kind of a dream or an illusion. But the vijnani, after attaining this state of nirvikalpa samadhi, after realizing Brahman, comes back from the state and realizes that this world itself is nothing but God, and realizes that the same divine reality is nirguna in one aspect, attributeless and impersonal, and saguna in another aspect, personal, and that the personal God can assume many forms. So the Vijnani has a more expansive realization of the divine reality than even most mystics. So, let me briefly summarize what are the four main tenets of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Number one, what's the nature of ultimate reality? The infinite divine reality is, in one aspect, the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, and in another aspect is Shakti, the personal God. And he would often say this with this famous teaching, Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman, by which he means impersonal Brahman, and Shakti, the personal God, who creates, preserves, and destroys this universe, who responds to our prayers, and so on and so forth, are equally real and inseparable aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. First tenet. Second, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti. This world is not unreal. Third, all the four yogas, most of you probably know what the four yogas are, but I'll just say them quickly. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action. Raja Yoga, the path of meditation and concentration. All of these are direct paths to God realization. And fourth, so actually there's not a fourth tenet, I'm just going to summarize it. So if we want to capture Vijnana Vedanta in a formula, we can say Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shakti Satyam. See, I'm adding Shakti. It's a hyphenated word because according to Sri Ramakrishna, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. So the ultimate reality is Brahma Shakti. I got this term from M, the author of the Gospel, actually. You don't find it in the Gospel, but you find it in this wonderful multi-volume work called Srimad Darshan, which involves dialogues between him and a monk who would visit him regularly. And he would refer to God as Brahma Shakti. Sri Ramakrishna's view of God is Brahma Shakti. I really like that expression, Brahma Shakti. It's very much like Tantra, Kashmiri Shaivism. So, the formula for Vijnana Vedanta, Brahma Shakti Satyam. It's true. This infinite divine reality, which is personal in one aspect and impersonal in another aspect, it's true, it's real. That's the ultimate reality. Jagat is Satyam, but the world is also true as a manifestation of Shakti. It's God's play, Shakti's play. How does Shankara's school of classical Advaita differ from Vijnana Vedanta? On almost all points, all three of these points. Number one, according to Shankara and his school, the ultimate reality is only nirguna, attributeless, impersonal, pure consciousness. And Shankara does not accept the ultimate reality of Shakti, the personal God. You might say, well, he wrote all these bhakti hymns. First of all, we don't know that he did. But secondly, go to his commentaries, because if you want authentic Shankara, try to find his belief in the personal God in the commentaries on the scriptures, the Vedantic scriptures. You'll be very hard-pressed to do so. Second, remember, Vijnana Vedanta says this world is a real manifestation of God. What does Shankara and his school say? They say that this world is ultimately non-existent. The only reality is Brahman. All names and forms are mithya. They're illusory. Vijnana Vedanta will say the names and forms themselves, this laptop, this microphone, those pews, are real manifestations of divine consciousness. And he said so on the basis of his own spiritual experiences. Third, remember about spiritual practice, Shankara says there's only one yoga that leads directly to liberation. You probably all know this, the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. But what does Sri Ramakrishna say? What does Swami Vivekananda say? All four yogas are equally equipped, equally capable to take us to the highest goal. Okay, so keep this in mind. Now, with regard to classical Advaita, as I said earlier, I promised that I would explain in what sense I take Advaita Vedanta to be inclusivist rather than pluralist. You'll find that there's always talk of higher and lower when it comes to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Swami Tapasananji was one of the most perceptive and scholarly monks in our order. He was a vice president. And he wrote a beautiful book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And in the introduction, before actually going into, he has different chapters on different Bhakti schools of Vedanta, one on Ramanuja, one on Madhva, one on Vallabha, and so on and so forth. But in the introduction, it's a very insightful 20 to 25 page introduction. He discusses some of the main doctrines of the different schools of Vedanta, including Advaita Vedanta, and then explains how he sees Sri Ramakrishna's and Vivekananda's philosophy as harmonizing the different traditional schools of Vedanta. And there's a section in that introduction entitled, The Patronizing Attitude of Advaita Vedanta. And he uses a metaphor, the same metaphor used by Frank Morales to criticize Sri Ramakrishna. But anyway, he used the metaphor of Mount Everest. And he says, Advaita Vedantins are like those standing at the top of Mount Everest, on the peak, and looking way down to the other religion, non-Advaitic paths. Not just other religions, but any Hindu path which is not Advaitic, so any theistic Hindu traditions, Vaishnavism and all that. They'll look down and say, hey, you guys are okay, but you'll eventually have to come up to our level. Through your path, it'll take you sort of part of the way up the mountain, but you can't reach the peak with your Christianity or your Islam or your theistic Hinduism. Eventually, you're going to have to give up your bhakti practices, practice the path of knowledge, and then you have to realize the highest goal, which is not what you think it is, which is dwelling in an eternal heaven. That's all nonsense. Forget about it. The true goal is realizing your true swarupa, your true nature as pure consciousness. So did Sri Ramakrishna hold this? I want each of you to think for yourselves about this. As I said, there's some monks in our order, there's some interpreters of Sri Ramakrishna who opt for this position. They think that he was an Advaitic inclusivist when it came to harmonizing the world religions, which means that he really did hold that Nirguna Brahman is the only ultimate truth, and that non-Advaitic paths can take you part of the way, but not all the way. I think that's pretty clearly wrong if you neutrally read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. You don't find this talk of higher and lower. And again, you find teachings which contradict classical Advaita, like the ones I just mentioned. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. That itself gives a completely different metaphysical basis for the harmony of religions. The highest is not just Nirguna Brahman, it's Brahma Shakti. Personal in one aspect and impersonal in the other. Obviously, that's going to have different philosophical implications than classical Advaita Vedanta. So, how does Sri Ramakrishna derive a genuine religious pluralism from his spiritual experience of Vijnana? Pluralism rather than inclusivism. One of my favorite teachings on the harmony of religions, this is in the Gospel, but it's not often discussed. We know the most famous teaching, as many faiths, so many paths, Joto Mot, Toto Pot. But I want to suggest that there's a more philosophically profound teaching conveying the same idea. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto, potho ananto. Why do I think that this is more philosophically profound than as many faiths, so many paths? Because as many faiths, so many paths is wonderful, but it doesn't explain why there are as many paths as there are faiths. But this teaching, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite, explains why there are infinite paths. It's because God is infinite that there are infinite paths to God. It's because God is both personal and impersonal. In God's personal aspect manifests in so many different forms of the personal God, Vishnu, Allah, so many. Allah's not without form, so sorry, that's a mistake. But all the different forms of the personal God in different traditions. And God also has an impersonal aspect. So it's on the basis of this doctrine of the infinite divine reality, to which there is never any limit, you can never put a limit to God, that you can then establish the genuine harmony of religions. That it's because God is infinite that there are correspondingly infinite paths to God. A little bit more concretely, imagine a Christian. Through the practice of Christianity, what's the goal? To realize Christ and to dwell in a Christian heaven. That Christian will get that goal. Why? Because the personal God is real. And the personal God actually incarnated as Christ, according to Sri Ramakrishna. And the personal God does have the Christ form in the form of God the Father. And you can dwell with Christ or God the Father in a Christian heaven. Same goes for all the other theistic traditions. But what about Advaita Vedanta? Sri Ramakrishna will say that's also a perfectly valid path. And their goal, even though their goal is different, through the practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, Advaitins will not go to any kind of heaven, but they're going to rest in their swarupa, their true nature, as non-dual pure consciousness. That's wonderful too. And one thing I wanted to mention, you might think, well, then he's saying that Sri Ramakrishna was not an Advaitin. No, I'm not saying that. He was also very much an Advaitin. But Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta does not have a monopoly on Advaitic philosophy. There are many different kinds of Advaita. In fact, one monk of our order, he very insightfully suggested to me, he said, you use the term Vijnana Vedanta. It's a term that I coined. He said, but I like a different term, because he said, the problem with Vijnana Vedanta is that it's misleading. It might make people think that it's not Advaitic. So he says, I like the term Vijnana Advaita Vedanta. Vijnana Advaita Vedanta. And he says that within Vedanta, there are three different kinds of Advaita philosophy. One is Shankara's Kevala Advaita philosophy. Kevala Advaita Vedanta. Kevala means absolute. Shankara's absolute non-dualism. Second kind of Advaita within Vedanta, Ramanuja's Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, qualified non-dualism. Third kind of Advaita, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Advaita Vedanta, which harmonizes all of the traditional schools of Vedanta. So I fully agree at the level of doctrine with what this monk was suggesting. It's a quibble about the name. I don't care what name you prefer, but I'm trying to argue for the doctrines here. So take whatever name you want. So now, Sri Ramakrishna, in his own inimitable way, often uses parables to explain very deep philosophical ideas. So he does this with respect to the harmony of religions. Two parables in particular. One is the parable of the chameleon, and the other is the parable of the blind man and the elephant, which many of you are familiar with. So I'm just going to paraphrase the chameleon parable instead of reading it out, because most of you are familiar with it. There's a chameleon on a tree. And one person goes to that tree, sees the chameleon as green, comes back and tells her friends, I saw this beautiful chameleon. It's green. It's this very vivid green. And so she says, oh, really? Let me go check it out. And then a second person goes, finds out my friend was lying to me. The chameleon's red. Comes back and says, why were you lying to me? And then they get in a fight with each other. Third one goes, sees that it's yellow, comes back. They're now at loggerheads. They used to be friends, and now they're very angry with each other. Now there's one adjudicator. Who is that adjudicator who steps in, who intervenes in this fight? The person sitting under the tree. There's some kind of weird guy who's sitting under the tree, who lives there, and he says, stop your fighting. You guys are all right and you're all wrong. You're all right, because you're right. In seeing the chameleon as red, you're also right in seeing it as yellow. You're also right in seeing it as green. It's a chameleon. Its whole nature is that it changes colors. Sometimes it has no color at all. And then, one of the lessons that Sri Ramakrishna draws. Sri Ramakrishna says, in like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. That person alone knows that God reveals herself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the person living under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and that person knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So I want to bring your attention to four features of this parable from a philosophical standpoint. Number one, all the different colors of the chameleon correspond to different forms of the personal God. It could be Christ, it could be Vishnu, Rama, Krishna, Ganesha, anything. Take your pick. Second, what about the colorless chameleon? Most of you can probably guess. It corresponds to the Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness of classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's school. Third, very important philosophical feature of this parable. Notice that it makes no sense to say that the colorless chameleon is somehow truer or more real than any of the colors that the chameleon assumes. They have equal status. The philosophical term was they have equal ontological status. Non-dual pure consciousness and all the different forms of the personal God, equally real. Very important philosophical lesson from this parable. Fourth, who is this mysterious person living in this tree for 24 hours? That person is the Vijnani. The person who has a more expansive spiritual realization of God, of the divine, in various forms of the personal God. On the one hand, Sri Ramakrishna himself is the best example. He practiced so many different religious traditions, and he realized God as Krishna, as Allah, as Jesus. The list goes on. But the Vijnani also realizes that same divine is also nirguna in another aspect, is also impersonal and attributeless in another aspect. Because he practiced Advaita Vedanta, and he realized that it's the same divine reality in its non-dual, impersonal aspect that he's realizing through the path of Advaita Vedanta. That's the person sitting on the tree who can intervene in these ongoing, millennia-long disputes, violence, and fighting among the world religions, saying, we're better, you're wrong, I'm right. Because that Vijnani has a more expansive knowledge of God. Second parable, blind men and the elephant. So the chameleon parable, as far as I'm aware, this seems to be unique to Sri Ramakrishna. He either came up with it or he heard it from somebody, but this is unique. Blind man and the elephant goes way back. And it's used by Jaina thinkers. I think even some Buddhist thinkers use the blind man and elephant parable. So it's not unique to him. But in the context of Vijnana Vedanta, it has some special philosophical implications. So again, I'm just going to paraphrase briefly. You all probably know this. There's a giant elephant, 5 blind men. They're each touching different parts of the elephant. One touches the tail and says the elephant's furry. One touches a toe and says, no, it's scaly, you're wrong. Another one touches the trunk and says, no, it's dry and it's flaky. And they all fight with each other, these blind people. And there's one person who can see, who's not blind. That person intervenes, just like that man sitting under the tree with the chameleon. Says, you're all right and you're all wrong, because you're all touching real parts of the elephant, but they're different parts of the elephant. That animal is an elephant. And because I can see the whole elephant, I can tell you that you're all partially correct, but never generalize on the basis of that aspect that you're perceiving and say that the whole of the elephant is what I'm touching now. Again, who is that person with vision? Who's the non-blind person? The Vijnani. The person who sees the whole elephant. Now, here we get a little bit of a philosophical nuance. What's the nuance? This parable, if taken at face value, seems to suggest that the Vijnani has gained spiritual knowledge of the whole of God, like he sees the whole elephant. But one important thing I find when we're studying Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is never take them out of context. Try to harmonize, reconcile the different teachings you find in the Gospel and in other books. And another teaching of his, which is very important, is that there's no limit to God. Nobody has ever known the whole of God. He would often say this with another parable, the ant and the sugar hill. An ant goes to a giant hill of sugar. With great difficulty, takes 1 grain and comes back and gets a little puffed up with pride and says, next time I go back, I'll take the whole hill with me. And Sri Ramakrishna laughs and says, this is crazy. Nobody can ever know the whole of God. So we have to counterbalance this blind man and the elephant parable. Let's not push it too far and think that the Vijnani has the whole knowledge of God. Nobody can attain comprehensive knowledge of God, and nobody needs to. But the Vijnani nonetheless has a more expansive spiritual realization of the divine than other people and even other mystics who tend to realize God in one particular form or aspect. Okay? So, now, just to sum up, before we get to the difficult questions, how I might answer them. So, Sri Ramakrishna was a full-blown religious pluralist, not an exclusivist, because he didn't think that only one religion is true or is effective and that all the others are hopeless. No, he was not an exclusivist, but he also wasn't an inclusivist. He didn't believe that his religion or that one particular religion is higher than the other religions, and that other religions aren't completely hopeless, but lower in some sense, inferior in some sense. They can take you part of the way, but not all of the way. They take you to lesser forms of salvation. No. He gives equal effectiveness, he grants equal effectiveness to many different world religions. That's what makes him a religious pluralist. How does he arrive at that view? On the basis of his spiritual experience of Vijnana, his own spiritual realization of the divine as vast and infinite, as limitless, and as personal in one aspect and impersonal in another aspect. Now, this is what's going to take up the remainder of this talk. These difficult questions are difficult to answer. So I'm going to give you my answers, and then I want all of you to think for yourselves about them. Just to remind you again, what is that first challenging question? We'll find, if we study the world's religious scriptures, that different religions hold different goals. They claim that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Advaita Vedantins, theistic Hindu schools, they all seem to be positing different goals in spiritual life. So how can Sri Ramakrishna claim that there's only one goal to which all the different religions are leading? That's the issue. Let me begin to respond to this, and especially respond to Frank Morales' objection, by quoting again, reminding you of 2 sentences from that criticism of Sri Ramakrishna that he makes. he says, Morales says, it is incumbent upon us all individually to choose for ourselves which of these many possibly correct absolute mountains we wish to scale. Only one of these mutually exclusive philosophical mountains, however, can be the correct one. And I think his fundamental mistake is in assuming that the different goals of the different world religions are mutually exclusive. I think this would be the right kind of response from a follower of Sri Ramakrishna. How do we arrive at this? The idea is that, so in different religions, they have different conceptions of the post-mortem state of salvation. Right? You'll find elaborate descriptions of what's called eschatology. And so in the Quran, you get these wonderful descriptions of what Jannah looks like, the Muslim heaven. In the Bible, you get some descriptions, and so on and so forth. Especially later theologians develop these pictures in great detail. In Hinduism, the Puranas and all these other texts are full of these kinds of descriptions of different heavens. Now, what does Sri Ramakrishna say? He harmonizes the different apparently conflicting conceptions of liberation, of salvation, with another beautiful metaphor. He says that devotees of the personal God prefer to eat sugar, while followers of the path of knowledge prefer to become sugar. So there are two fundamentally different paradigms of liberation, both of which are true. And bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, for them, the goal is dwelling in an eternal heaven with their chosen deity, with their preferred form of the personal God. And there are many, not just one. Why should there be just one? There are many. There's the Christian heaven, there's the Muslim heaven, there's so many kinds of theistic Hindu heavens, lokas. And the Advaita Vedanta says, this is all nonsense, I'm not interested. I want to become sugar. And Sri Ramakrishna says, they'll get that. There's no coming and going for Advaita Vedantins, for followers of the path of knowledge. For them, liberation consists in resting in their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. You might say, well, how is this even possible? Aren't they contradictory, these pictures of salvation? I'll say no. Right now, we're sitting in this room together. There might be somebody in the kitchen. Is that contradictory? No. Why can't we conceive of salvation, this post-mortem eschatological state of salvation, as a many-roomed mansion with many different rooms? There's a Christian room, which liberated Christians can enter and dwell in. There's the Muslim room. Muslims go into that one. Different theistic Hindus have different rooms. Let them enter their rooms. Advaitins will have their room. What's the problem? Where's the contradiction here? So I think that's Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint. You might say, give me evidence. So I'll give you one piece of evidence. This is from the Gospel. Mohima Chakraborty was a staunch follower of Shankara's classical Advaitic school. So he played this game of higher and lower, as they often do. And he said, okay, I mean, bhakti's all right, but it won't take you to the highest goal. Even bhaktas ultimately have to attain what he calls nirvana. And here he's not thinking about it in the Buddhist sense, but in the Advaitic sense. Ultimately, you have to give up your individuality and merge it in non-dual pure consciousness, which is your true nature. That's his view from the classical Advaitic standpoint. This is Shankara's position. Mohima asks Sri Ramakrishna, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? Sri Ramakrishna, it cannot be said that bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitto Krishna ta nitto bhakto. Krishna is consciousness embodied, and his abode also, his abode, the transcendental loka, is also consciousness embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. So Sri Ramakrishna rejects this kind of Advaitic, we might call it an Advaitic superiority complex. Bhakti is all right, but it's a lower practice. It can take you part of the way, but the ultimate goal is merging in non-dual pure consciousness. Sri Ramakrishna says no. There are two fundamentally different paradigms of salvation, of liberation. Eating sugar, becoming sugar, and it's not the case that becoming sugar is the higher state or the final state. Both are equally true and valid and valuable, and it's a matter of preference. What is the preference of the liberated soul? If you want to eat sugar to your heart's content, in whatever heaven you choose, loka. If you want to become sugar, you become sugar, but don't look down on those who prefer to eat sugar. All right. So that's my answer to that first tough question and that objection lodged by Frank Morales, is that he's mistaken in thinking that the different goals of the different world religions are mutually exclusive. I think from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint, they're not. And it's not just a dogmatic assertion. He actually realized God in different forms and aspects and realized that these goals are actually complementary rather than conflicting. Second question, remember, is, to jog your memory, what would Sri Ramakrishna say about religiously inspired terrorist organizations? And more generally, it doesn't even have to be religious groups that commit violence, but what about religious organizations which emphasize selfishness and doing all sorts of crazy stuff, which seems to be strengthening and gratifying ego rather than diminishing ego. We'll get to this in a second. So I don't want to just restrict it to just religiously inspired terrorist groups, but just any religion which calls itself a religion, so self-styled religions, which engage in unethical practices. That's the more general word I want to use. Whether that consists in violence or excessive sense indulgence or egoism or selfishness, whatever you want to call it. I think that Sri Ramakrishna would not count any religion, quote, in quotes, any quote-unquote religion that prescribes unethical practices as genuine religions. So he would exclude them from his doctrine of the harmony of religions. Why do I say this? Admittedly, there's no direct evidence for this, but what I found is, what everybody will find when they read the gospel, again and again he teaches that the essence of every true religious path is that it prescribes spiritual practices and ethical practices which diminish egoism and selfishness, and thereby bring us closer to the divine. One of his common statements is, "Ami mole ghutibe janjal." When the ego dies, all troubles will cease. And every true religion has to be one that teaches practices which help us diminish our selfishness, diminish our egoism, and make us more selfless, make us more altruistic. And so I think that he would, by that definition, he would exclude any religious organization that preaches violence, that teaches violence. And this reminds me of an incident in Sri Ramakrishna's life when a sadhu comes to visit, living nearby, and Sri Ramakrishna hears some strange things about, he was a sannyasi, so he's expected to be celibate. And he hears that this monk is having an affair with a woman. And so he confronts this monk about it. And he says, "What is this I hear about this affair you're having with this woman?" And the monk, very confidently and without missing a beat, says, "Let me tell you." And he brings in classical Advaita Vedanta philosophy. And he says, "See, all of this is a dream. All of this is Maya. So how can my affair with that woman alone be real? That's also Maya. Do I have to teach you these things? Come on." And so Sri Ramakrishna, completely stunned, he says, "I piss on your Vedanta." Tor Vedanta mute di. First of all, that's such strong language that it's censored in most translations and it's kind of Baudelarized. It becomes, "I spit on your Vedanta." That's a little too sanitized for my taste. I spit. And not just I spit on Vedanta, I spit on your Vedanta. That's not the true Vedanta. That's what I want to emphasize here. I spit on your Vedanta. What you're calling Advaita Vedanta is not the real thing. It's a sham. See, he's excluding this as a religious path. He's not saying that this fallen monk's philosophy can also take you to the highest goal. That's nonsense. You'll only be fooling yourself, okay? So this is my overall understanding of a Ramakrishnan answer to question number 2, which is, if you say that all religions lead to the same goal, isn't there this danger of being too inclusive and including so-called religions which are violent, which involve killing, which are extremely unethical? And he says right from the outset, these don't count as religions in the first place because they prescribe unethical practices. Answer number 2. Number 3, this is a big can of worms. It's what's called, as I mentioned, the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. Different religions make conflicting claims all the time, not all the time, but frequently, about the nature of ultimate reality, which spiritual practices take us to the highest goal, all sorts of things. Different metaphysical doctrines, different historical doctrines. How can Sri Ramakrishna say that they all lead to the same goal if they contradict each other at so many points? That's the question. The key here is Sri Ramakrishna never claimed that all religions are true. Now, immediately, somebody like Mahayoganandaji might pounce on me and say, well, there's one place where he does say all religions are true. It's true. Shab dharme shotto. He says it, or shab mat shotto. He used the word shotto, which means true. But if you look at the context, what he means is they are true as effective paths to God realization. He never says that all the doctrines of every religion are true. Why doesn't he say that? Because he'll be committing a host of contradictions. If he really said that all the doctrines of all the religions are true, he's going to have to say that, yes, Christ did die on the cross because I accept Christianity. But Christ also didn't die on the cross because I accept Islam. I believe in karma and rebirth because I accept Buddhism and Hinduism. I don't accept karma and rebirth because I accept Orthodox Abrahamic religions. It would be nonsense. He never claimed this. He never claimed that all the doctrines of all religions are true. He said that they are equally effective paths in leading to God realization, the same goal. So that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. But we're not through with answering this question because it's a tricky question. John Hick was a very prominent philosopher of religion. He was also a religious pluralist. So he's a kind of kindred spirit of Sri Ramakrishna's. And he, in a very rigorous way, tried to defend religious pluralism. And he tackled this problem of conflicting religious truth claims head on. And he said the best way to respond to this problem is to distinguish three types of conflicting religious truth claims. Number one, conflicting historical truth claims. A good example is, did Christ die on the cross? It's a historical question. Either he did or he didn't die on the cross. And if somebody were there at the time, in principle, that debate could be adjudicated. He could say, yeah, I saw Christ get crucified, and so I know that he died on the cross. But there are two other types of conflicting religious truth claims. Second, what Hick calls trans-historical truth claims. These are claims which cannot be verified by empirical evidence, by historical evidence. What are examples? Hick claims that rebirth and karma are like this. It gets a little bit iffy these days because now there's more and more kind of mounting empirical evidence for at least rebirth because of these very interesting cases of young children who have knowledge of their past lives. But anyway, so we don't even have to discuss which doctrines fall under that, but in any case, the second kind of conflicting religious truth claims are trans-historical truth claims that conflict across religions. And the third type of conflicting religious truth claim are truth claims about the nature of ultimate reality. What is the nature of ultimate reality? Christianity says it's God the Father, Allah, or the Trinity, Holy Spirit. Muslims will say Allah, Vaishnavas, Krishna, Advaita Vedantins, none of that, non-dual pure consciousness. They conflict. They all think that they conflict. You know, Ramanuja says, I believe in Vishnu, Narayana, and therefore I don't believe in the reality of non-dual pure consciousness at all. He says it. And these games have been going on for centuries. So, I would distinguish Sri Ramakrishna's response to the first two types of conflicting religious truth claims. What are those first two types? Historical and trans-historical. From his response to the third type. Okay, let's distinguish these. That's why I bring in Hick's classification. How does he respond to the first two types? Conflicting historical and trans-historical truth claims. Let me read you a passage in this context. He says, that yearning, vyakulata, is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahmo. By Brahmo, it means followers of the 19th century movement, Brahmo Samaj. The vital point is yearning, vyakulata in Bengali. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path. Only you must be restless for God. God herself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. This is very important. There are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks her watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. This is a very philosophically important passage for a number of reasons. He's saying, number one, no religion has a monopoly on truth. No religion is 100% true and the other religions are sort of 90% or 70% or 20%. No. Every religion has some mistakes. But and he says it's like a watch, right? Everyone thinks their own watch is right. No watch tells exactly the right time, even though these days with smartwatches and smartphones. Anyway, it's a little bit complicated. But in any case, he says, the crucial thing is, whatever mistakes there are in a given religion, they don't handicap that religion from the standpoint of liberation, of salvation. Those mistakes at the level of historical truth claims, whether Krishna actually, or whether God actually incarnated as Krishna, whether God incarnated as Christ, whether Christ died on the cross, whether rebirth is true, he says there definitely is a fact of the matter. Everybody can't be right. It can't be the case that rebirth is true for some people and not true for other people. There has to be some universal truth about it. But it doesn't matter. Even if you get it wrong, even if you get these things wrong, your religion can still be a perfectly effective path in bringing you to the highest goal of salvation, of liberation. So that's, I think, his take on the first two types of conflicting religious truth claim, historical and transhistorical. I think he takes a different tack with respect to the third type, which is conflicting truth claims in different world religions about the nature of ultimate reality. Is God personal or impersonal, with form, without form? If God is with form, what form? That's also kind of, a lot of bhakti schools in different traditions argue with each other. No, the form of God is this, and he's got earrings, and it's this. And so even the bhaktas are at loggerheads often, the devotees. So what's Sri Ramakrishna's stance on this? He says, like the man sitting under the tree, like the person with sight who intervenes in the fight between the blind man and with regard to the elephant, he was a Vijnani, and he said that, these different claims about the nature of ultimate reality do seem to be conflicting, but I know that they're actually complementary. How do you know? Because I've realized different forms of the personal God, and I've realized non-dual pure consciousness through the path of Advaita Vedanta, and I know, on the basis of my experiences, that they're all different aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. Fourth big question, very difficult question. A lot of scholars have criticized our tradition on these grounds. It's all well and good to say that theistic religious traditions can lead to the same goal. So, Orthodox Abrahamic religions, all the different theistic schools of Hinduism. It's also fine to say that Advaita Vedanta can be a valid path to liberation through the path of the knowledge. But what about Buddhism? It's a very tricky question. What about Buddhism? What is the goal for Buddhists? It's nirvana. And nirvana seems difficult to square with either of these goals, whether the theistic goal of dwelling in an eternal heaven or the Advaitic goal of resting in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Because a lot of Buddhist schools don't accept the very reality of non-dual pure consciousness. Ninian Smart is an example of a prominent scholar. I think he was a professor at UCSB for a long time. They have a very strong, or they used to have a very strong religion department. They still do, maybe. So he made this criticism. I'll just read out to you his criticism of what he calls a neo-Advaitic harmonizing of religions, but under which, and he singles out Vivekananda, but one could also make the same objection apply to Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. He says, the ultimate reality is presented in a substantialist way in neo-Advaita. What does he mean by substantialist? He means they conceive ultimate reality in a positive way. It's a positive state or reality. It's not strictly negative. The ultimate reality is presented in a substantialist way in Neo-Advaita. This does not seem to square with Theravada Nirvana or with Mahayana Shunyata, the doctrine of emptiness. Then he adds, though the latter sometimes functions a bit like a ghost substance. So he's a scholar, so he always has to add some nuances. But in any case, but what's the main thrust of his criticism? He says, any Vedantic model of religious pluralism, like Sri Ramakrishna's, like Swami Vivekananda's, presupposes what he calls a substantialist understanding of ultimate reality as a positive entity of some sort, a positive reality or state, whatever that state might be. And that doesn't square with Theravada Buddhism, which does not accept any kind of ultimate reality in a positive sense, and Mahayana Buddhism, according to Smart. And we'll get to whether that's actually fair. And so therefore, Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is insufficiently broad, insufficiently liberal. Buddhism throws a wrench into his whole grand plan of harmonizing the world religions. How do we respond to this question, this big, difficult question? Let's begin. So now, one thing, in the Gospel you'll find, I don't think there's a single occurrence, any place where Sri Ramakrishna refers to Buddhism. But he does refer to Buddha, and there's a distinction here that I think is significant. Let me read you what he says about Buddha. Narendra, as usual, is always provocative, and so he's talking to Sri Ramakrishna. Narendra meaning Vivek, the future Vivekananda. He says, Buddha was an atheist. Sri Ramakrishna says, in response, Buddha was not an atheist. He simply could not express the reality in words. Do you know what Buddha means? By meditating on one's own Bodha Swarupa, which means one's true nature as pure consciousness, Bodha Swarupa. One becomes that Bodha Swarupa, pure consciousness. Then he adds, why should Buddha be called an atheist? When one realizes one's Swarupa, the true nature of one's self as pure consciousness, one attains a state that is something between asti and nasti. It's a very precise philosophical formulation. You attain a state that is something between is and is not. These are Sanskrit terms, asti, nasti. I have to read the original Bangla because it's so philosophically important. Nastik keno, nastik noy, mukhe bolte pare nai. Buddha ki jano, bodh shorup ke chinta kore kore, tai hoa. Bodh shorup hoa. This should remind us of becoming sugar. He's saying, okay, even though Buddha didn't explicitly talk about the state of nirvana as the realization of your true nature as pure consciousness, as Bodhisvarupa, nonetheless it's implied. And you actually become that Bodhisvarupa. There's no eternal heaven for the Buddhists, but they accepted an Advaitic state of pure consciousness, which is their goal. Now, Smart will come in here. Ninian Smart is smart. He's a smart scholar, and so I'm punning on his name. And he'll come in and say, well, that's all well and good, but what you're doing is exactly my problem with your harmony of religions, because you're Vedantizing Buddhism. You're Vedantizing the state of nirvana, which clearly is not intended to be pure consciousness. And that's not right. You're not honoring the specificity of Buddhism as a religion, as a distinct religion from other religions. So now, how do we respond to Ninian Smart's objection? Let's distinguish three different questions. Number one, how did the Buddha conceive of nirvana? That's one question. And is Sri Ramakrishna right in his understanding of the Buddha's teachings? Second question, how does Sri Ramakrishna accommodate the Theravada school of Buddhism, which definitely, uncontroversially, does not conceive nirvana as Bodhisvarupa, as pure consciousness? The Theravada school, at the very least, conceives, it doesn't even accept an ultimate reality in that sense, in the sense of Vedanta. So how does he accommodate Theravada Buddhism? That's a distinct question from what were Buddha's teachings. There's a third distinct question. How does Sri Ramakrishna accommodate Mahayana Buddhism? So we have to separate these three questions. So that's why it gets a little complicated in answering how does Sri Ramakrishna accommodate Buddhism? There isn't just Buddhism. We shouldn't think in monolithic terms like that. We have to distinguish Buddha's teachings, Theravada teachings, Mahayana teachings. So let's go one by one. What are Buddha's views on nirvana? In fact, what's interesting, if you study the contemporary scholarship, there are a number of contemporary scholars who defend something like Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of Buddha's views on nirvana. Let me give you examples. Edward Kanzi, I guess you pronounce it. Perry Schmidt-Leugel is a friend of mine. He's a German theologian living now and doing wonderful work. They all say that, look, the Buddha did teach anatta in Pali, which means the no-self doctrine, anatma. But everything depends on how you interpret the no-self doctrine. And so, for instance, one scholar who defends this kind of Ramakrishnan understanding of the Buddha's teachings is Kamaleshwar Bhattacharya. He says, the Buddha does not deny the Upanishadic Atman. On the contrary, he indirectly affirms it in denying that which is falsely believed to be the Atman. So what he's saying is, the Anatma doctrine, this no-self doctrine, is not denying that there's any true non-dual self, an Atman. It's denying that you are the body-mind. You're not the body, you're not the mind, you're not the empirical self. But Buddha never denies that there's a higher self. which you can realize in the state of nirvana. This is his claim, but you might say, well, that's nice to claim it, but where's the evidence? So again, let's go to the Pali Tipitaka, which is the most important repository of Buddha's teachings. They're considered authentic by all Buddhist traditions. In the Sanyutta Nikaya, Vacchagotta asks the Buddha a very important question: is there a self? And the Buddha, I'm taking this directly from this Sanyutta Nikaya, the Buddha remains silent, doesn't answer the question. And Vacchagotta then asks the Buddha, then is there no self? And the Buddha remains silent again. So this could easily be taken as a kind of, don't worry. So I'm like as taking Buddha to mean, I'm not just saying that there's no higher self. That would be wrong. I'm also not saying that there is a higher self. Do the practice. That's often something that Buddha emphasized, is that when somebody shoots you with an arrow, are you going to, who shot me? You know, and no, you want to get the arrow out as quickly as possible. So that was always kind of Buddha's orientation, is don't focus on these metaphysical questions so much. But there's an even stronger passage in support of Sri Ramakrishna's interpretation of the Buddha's teachings. This is from the Khuddaka Nikaya. The Buddha himself describes nirvana as follows. He says, monks, there is a not born. These are all hyphenated words. A not born, a not become, a not made, a not compounded. Monks, if that unborn, not become, not made, not compounded were not, there would be apparent no escape from this here that is born, become, made, compounded. So I think this is very strong textual evidence in Buddha's teachings that he said that in order for salvation, liberation to even be possible, you have to posit an ultimate reality. And Sri Ramakrishna chooses to call that Bodha Swarupa, pure consciousness. So, not all scholars agree, but some do, and that seems good enough to me. Second, the question of Theravada Buddhism. They are definitely not substantialists. They don't accept any kind of ultimate reality. What is Sri Ramakrishna's stance? I think his view is that even non-substantialist schools of Buddhism are perfectly effective paths in bringing us to the highest goal, even though they're mistaken in their understanding of ultimate reality. This seems to be the position. So we have to distinguish these two things. His harmony of religions view does not say that all religions are true across the board about everything, as I said already. So he's perfectly entitled to disagree with certain doctrines in Theravada Buddhism. He may say to the Theravada Buddhists something like this: it's totally fine that you don't accept any kind of ultimate reality. Don't believe in Bodhiswarupa. Practice your Ashtanga Marga that the Buddha taught you to the best of your ability, sincerely. Strive for liberation, for nirvana. And you might be surprised at the end of your spiritual practices by what you find. This seems to be his response not only to Theravada, but also to certain schools of Mahayana Buddhism. So because I don't have much time, I'm not going to go into all the details. But with respect to Mahayana Buddhism, part of the problems that Ninian Smart is he overgeneralizes, because Mahayana Buddhism itself is internally variegated. There are many different sub-schools within Mahayana. Some are non-substantialist, to which Sri Ramakrishna would reply in the same way that he replies to the Theravadan Buddhists. Through your path, you non-substantialist Mahayana Buddhists, you will realize the goal that you're coveting, nirvana. But when you reach that goal, you're going to realize that nirvana is not a strictly negative state, it's actually pure consciousness. But there are also substantialist schools of Mahayana Buddhism. And this is interesting. T.R.V. Murthy wrote an important study in 1955 called The Central Philosophy of Buddhism, where he quotes from a Mahayana text, Ratnakuta Sutra. This is the direct statement. That Atman is, and it's quoted, that Atman is one end. That Atman is not is another. But the middle between the Atma and Nairatmya views, so Atman and no Atma views, is the inexpressible. It is the reflective review of things. So remember what Sri Ramakrishna says. That state that the Buddha was talking about is between Asti and Nasti. It's literally the same language used in this Mahayana Buddhist text, Ratnakuta Sutra. So these kinds of passages can support, arguably, the view that there are some schools of Mahayana Buddhism which are substantialist and which perfectly agree with Sri Ramakrishna's views of Bodhiswarupa. The non-substantialist schools, he'll disagree with their view of ultimate reality, but still accept them as effective paths to liberation. And now, final question, because it's now 12:09, so sorry. There's a fifth, maybe I'll just try to very briefly tackle this last question. How do we know that Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is true in the first place? It's all well and good. It's nice to feel good about yourself and say that we accept all religions, but how do we know it's true? Any follower of Sri Ramakrishna will say, because he realized God in so many different forms, he actually underwent so many different religious practices and different traditions. So he's speaking on the basis of his own spiritual experiences. That's nice, but what about people who don't accept his practices? For instance, the same friend of mine in Germany, Perry Schmidt-Leukel, there was a book symposium published on my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, where 13 scholars wrote responses. One of them is Perry Schmidt-Leukel. And he says at the end of his response, he says, okay, so Sri Ramakrishna claimed to have practiced Christianity for 3 days, but does that really count as Christian practice? That sounds pretty superficial to me, pretty shoddy. What can you get in 3 days? How would you respond to that objection? What I would say is, this is just an example. Think about mathematicians. Think about an average mathematician in relation to a mathematical genius. What it might take a lifetime for an average mathematician to solve some kind of difficult problem, some mathematical puzzle, it could take a mathematical genius a matter of a few hours or a few days, 3 days maybe. So in the same way, I take Sri Ramakrishna to be a spiritual genius. And a skeptic might say, well, why should we? You don't have to, but you should accept the fact that just as you think that there are some people who are geniuses in math or in physics or in chemistry, why can't there also be geniuses in the spiritual domain? And there are other average Christians who go to church every Sunday, who read the Bible, but very little progress because they're too immersed in worldly enjoyments and attachments. But who is Sri Ramakrishna? Absolutely pure in heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so he was the fittest of all spiritual aspirants to practice Christianity. And you have to take that into account when you try to understand his 3-day practice of Christianity. You also have to take into account the fact that he had a picture of Jesus hanging in his room, that he worshipped him as God, that he kept a copy of the Bible with him and read out and asked people to read out from it at times, and that he followed Christ's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount to a T. Okay, and finally, I'm just going to conclude on this note. It's logically possible for a religious pluralist, somebody who believes that religions other than my own are equally effective paths in leading to the same goal, and at the same time be completely indifferent to other religions. And say, you guys do you be you, and I'll be me, and more power to you. Through your path, you're going to realize the same goal as I'm going to realize. But I don't care about, why should I read the Bible? Why should I interact with Christians or Muslims or Buddhists? Perfectly logical attitude. All I've been saying now is compatible with that. What I want to say is that Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda have gone much further. They are not just religious pluralists, but they are religious cosmopolitans. They argued for the need to actively learn from religions other than our own. Why? Because God is infinite. Again, that same premise. Because God is infinite, we can learn more about the infinite God by exposing ourselves to religious traditions other than our own. We can also enrich our spiritual lives in other ways. How? Because every religion will emphasize certain spiritual practices. And so, in our own spiritual life, we can sort of integrate aspects of other religious traditions. For instance, I really like Buddhist mindfulness. I've incorporated that into my Vedantic practice, for instance. And there's so many ways that you can do that. You can learn from devotional traditions and so on and so forth. And finally, one question could be, well, isn't that more a recipe for spiritual dilettantism? Isn't that ultimately superficial? I'm going to dabble in this religion here and take this from that. What Swami Vivekananda taught is you have to remain firmly grounded in your own religious tradition, and on that basis you can freely learn from other religious traditions. Sri Ramakrishna said, if you dig in one place for 5 minutes and say, oh, my back is sore and I'm getting bored, and so you move on to you go 5 feet away and you start digging there, you'll never dig deep. What Swami Vivekananda said is, you want the depth of the ocean and the expansiveness of the sky. And he saw Sri Ramakrishna as the shining example of this. So let's all strive to be as deep as the ocean and as infinite as the sky. Thank you. Next week is the 9th. Swami Arupeshanandaji is giving a lecture, a Sunday talk here, on the hope of Easter. It's Easter next Sunday, and therefore it's a relevant talk. And what else we got? What else should I announce?
You'll be speaking you'll be taking questions?
Yes, thank you. I'll be taking questions now in the green room. So if you have any burning questions or you have completely different answers from the ones that I gave to any of these 5 difficult questions, I'd love to hear them.
Karma Yoga is on the 15th.
Okay, refreshments are outside, right? Outside. And Karma Yoga is on the 15th of April, Saturday, 15th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m.
We have reinstituted our Karma Yoga. We invite you to join us in doing some service at the temple, maybe working in the garden or cleaning up a messy basement or washing windows. It's a great way to participate in our activities. So that'll be Saturday the 15th, starting at 9.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Hope to see you guys in the green room.